So I'm going to start with something that's familiar territory to me. Like I said, I'm largely a refugee law person, not so much a migration person. I am going to start by asking Mr. Golageri the first question, which is he spoke about this regime for the management of people on the move not really being existent at an international level, which is quite true. We do have certain agencies. Like he said, for goods and even for services, there is the WTO, which regulates transactions. But there's nothing quite on a similar scale and quite as respected, let's say, for people. What I was going to say was there is the UNHCR, which is supposed to be the agency. It's a legitimate UN mandated agency that regulates the movement of refugees and asylum seekers, which is understandably, I mean, admittedly, the most vulnerable class of migrants, because they are forced migrants. They are people who are leaving their countries, traveling without even really wanting to and without being prepared for it in most cases. So what I would like to say is, what is your view on this? Why is UNHCR discounted, not just here, but generally, as the agency that is supposed to be respected and looked to for regulating the flow of migrants? Why is it largely something that governments adhere to only voluntarily, not mandatorily? Is it losing relevance? Has it ever had a lot of relevance, to be honest? That's, I think, the first thing. I will start there, and then I have a couple of questions for each of the other panelists, and then we can throw it open to the audience.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a very important question. So let me, illustrate what the problem is by referring to the WTO. Okay. So what is, as lawyers, what do you think is the difference between the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs that was existent prior to the WTO and the WTO? One was that the WTO became a rule-based binding arrangement, institutional arrangement. You had to become a member and you were bound by the rules of the WTO. Second was that the WTO provided for a dispute resolution mechanism, which means if you were a defaulter, there would be consequences that would follow, right? Now, the problem with the international migration regime, whether you look at any one of the three dimensions that I spoke about, let's take economic migration for mobility of labor, pure and simple. There are no problems about asylum, refugees, prisons, etc. Just mobility of labor. Is there an international regime? No. If there is some kind of an arrangement, it's mostly bilateral. And at a multilateral level, you have the Global Forum on Migration and Development, but they are all non-binding. So the UNHCR, without doubt, has played an extremely important role. I think it's an important institution, but its influence is limited simply because it is within the sovereign powers of a state to either agree to what it says or disagree, right? If India was not to act on a UNHCR recommendation, what consequences will follow? Nothing, right? So I think there is a need now at the global level to have, simply because, see, we spoke about numbers. Dr. Venkatrao in his opening remarks spoke about how there are 240 million, that it has grown from 140 to 240. That's a bit of a, statistics mask more than they tell. Fact is that if you look at the last 30 years, the global population of migrants has remained at roughly 3% of the global population. Okay? So the jump from 140 to 240 happened more because borders moved rather than people moving. After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, many of the people who were, Russians who are in Ukrainian territory or Bulgarians who are in Hungarian territory, etc., found themselves as migrants because they were non-nationals of that country. So I don't think numbers is the problem. I think the question really is, and this is my answer, since the complexity of mobility, global mobility, has increased, covering most countries, there's scarcely any country that is not affected by migration, either as origin, destination, or transit. Second, they're mostly problems of a transnational nature, where it's not just a relationship, as I said, between the individual and the state, but also between state and state. And therefore, you need sovereign nations to cede some part of their sovereignty to a supranational body, which will be a rule-based body which can enforce, international law. Last point is, I think there is also the problem of harmonization across countries, harmonization of law. So for all of these reasons, UNHCR and many of the other initiatives of the United Nations have been less than optimal.
Thank you. I think I will ask Sita my next question. Since you spoke, a couple of things actually. India and the Global Compact on Migration, India's role has largely been, whatever we've read in the papers and everything, it's largely been about this insistence, like you said, on regular migration and how they only want to encourage regular migration. So again, stigmatizing irregular migration. But obviously, India has a lot of irregular migrants as well. It may not have the world's largest number of irregular migrants. And the majority of our immigrants may be regular, people with documents. But we do have a very large number of people who do go abroad without documentation, through touts, through agents. We've all read media coverage of it, which is really, it's quite popular. It's common knowledge that in certain parts of the country, people do leave for better opportunities abroad. So my question is really, why this insistence, firstly? Why this sort of pushing aside these people who are also ours? Because you may go to another country, but you don't lose citizenship of India. They are not stateless people. A lot of them can establish Indian nationality, I'm sure, by the usual routes, by saying, this is where I'm from, this is my village. And then the government or whoever the agency mandated is doing that check and finding out that, yes, this person does indeed belong to this particular village in this state. So why this sort of pushing these people aside? The second thing I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is this divergent regime for Nepalis and Bangladeshis. I think a lot of us are not going into the reason for why Nepali immigrants are accepted much faster than Bangladeshi immigrants. They provide the same kind of services. There are other issues at play. There are political considerations, there are communal issues. Those are all very much a part of the migration discourse. Migration is not just about people coming in and taking away jobs. We are okay with certain people coming in and taking away jobs or doing those jobs. We are not okay with certain other people coming and doing those jobs even for cheaper rates. Why is that? So there are lots of other factors at play, which are largely of culture, of comfort with a certain population. And I think as lawyers, we don't go into those issues because, again, we believe that everybody is equal in the eyes of the law, but the fact is that they're not. So maybe, a little bit more on that divergence. Thank you.
Okay. So two questions, and separately. I have touched on them when I was speaking. But on the irregular migration, I mean, it does... there are two factors here. India does want to promote regular migration, and that is a good thing. Like I said, they really see that this is also the solution of how you engage with the world, how a positive engagement on migration can actually take place, is when you actually do not... you focus on the regular passage, you focus on the regular corridors, you look at how more of regular migration can happen so that the irregular migration is actually reduced in a way. But there's also, and I've been trying to stay away from this in a way, but there is a truth in the fact that if you meet with some of these irregular migrants, and they're Indians, there's no doubt about it, this part of we cannot prove the Indianness in today's world is shrinking, to be honest. Our passports are biometric, we have so much more communication that links up people. It's easier to prove that somebody is Indian than it ever was before. So, but it's used as very much, the reasoning. But when I meet, and I've met many of them, there is a certain apathy. There is a certain, it's almost as if they could be sacrificed. It's okay, we can forget about them. Because they come from certain groups of India which are not so relevant to us, which can be left out. It's okay. They have been clubbed as anti-state if you're coming from Punjab. And this has happened very often, that you are kind of, because you're from Punjab, you're automatically treated with a certain level of discrimination, which should not be happening, but it does happen. and that you and that you are kind of showing India low and down by coming in irregularly. So already in the eyes of some of the people who are upholding India globally, this is a problem, that you have all these irregular migrants coming in. And there isn't much understanding shown towards them, or the fact that maybe, and a lot of them do come from Punjab if you're in the West, there's something happening in Punjab which is very wrong, which is actually pushing some of these people out. But that is not to be taken into consideration at some levels. And this is problematic. I mean, I won't say that it is not problematic. They also belong to classes that don't have the political standing that you and I would have in spaces. They don't form, the diaspora can be quite split. In fact, when we speak of diaspora, we often speak of those in the West who are highly educated and come from a certain group, whereas we forget some of the Gulf sometimes. We treat them more as, you know, these are the Indian workers, whereas the diaspora is actually the one in the US. So this is a problem of our thinking. This is how we have over years also been looking at migration, because we've not looked at it in frameworks. We've just used our lenses that are a reflection of our existence in our society as it is today. So I think these are some of the problems, and we've just taken them on. Because we don't have frameworks, because we don't have some of the structures that would help us to think through some of these things, or give us the policy direction that is needed to address some of these things, without, like lawyers, I would say, so with the fairness that is needed on them, without the biasness that comes in if you don't have these frameworks. So I think this has stayed on, and this is why the irregular debate has, I mean, the discourse from India has been the way it has been, I feel, in some ways. On the Nepali and Bangladeshi issue, like you said, it's migration is not about one thing or the other. It is a multitude of things, and politics is very high on migration, if not the highest. In fact, we are trying to look at a paper that looks at politics in this. And Nepal has been a huge political angle for us also. I mean, the friendship treaty is open borders. It's remarkable that we have an open border where Nepalis can come in and have access to our markets, our societies, and this has been almost natural because it's been an open border. You almost think that if you actually let it happen on the other side, you might actually have a better world. But it has been very political more than anything else. The Nepali reason to have this friendship, to have this open border, has, Nepal plays this role of protecting us from China, let's not forget it. And that's been part of the reason of why we have such had such friendly relations with Nepal. So I would think that a lot of migration cannot be seen in isolation, and we should not see it in isolation because of the fact that it is linked to so many other issues. It's linked to communal issues as well. I mean, this is true. We can't run away from it. However sticky and difficult these issues are, they are real. And they exist, and it is important for us to understand them and know that they are there, and that they form our biases as well, and they form how policy is made sometimes as well. And therefore, the Nepalis and the Bangladeshis will always be seen differently, I think, in this country, despite the fact that they needn't be. There's nothing one is doing or the other is not doing. They needn't be seen like that, but that's just the nature of how societies are actually, and how sovereign states are. I mean, we can all want a borderless world, but we live in a world which is increasingly having larger borders and stronger borders than ever before. So, yeah.
So would you like to respond, especially on the first question? I was just wondering if there was some kind of an explanation for this insistence on regular migration. And just those 97 people that you spoke about, the 6 that were Indian, possibly irregular migrants, without papers, they had left India, let's say, illegally to go to another country. How would the government respond to that? Because like in the case of the 40 workers from Punjab and Iraq, the unfortunate events that transpired there, we do know that the government was, well, kind of dragged its feet on it, let's say. I can say this as someone from civil society at least. Dragged its feet on it, didn't do quite what would have been ideal in terms of rescuing them as soon as possible, or at least taking that up and kind of finding out their whereabouts. Mostly because they were, again, irregular. There was no documentation of them having left through the right legal channels?
Yeah, very brief response would be that, I think it's time to look at conceptually how irregular migration, smuggled people, and trafficked people are different. Okay, in the real world, there's one common principle that underlies all the three categories. How easy do you think it is for an Indian, a poor Indian, an illiterate Indian, to actually reach Iraq, or to reach Spain, or to reach any country where he is found either as an irregular migrant or as a refugee or as a smuggled or trafficked person? So I think the first thing you must recognize is that all of these are objects of cartels. An irregular migrant doesn't go on his own. Yes, they do. There may be an odd case, but first of all, I think you should know that India has the least number of irregular migrants in the world. Okay, and India's unstated policy has been zero tolerance to irregular emigration. Okay, but then what is happening is that there is need to act against the cartels which actually control irregular migration, even in Punjab, and cartels which control smuggling. So irregular migration is simply enabling a cartel or a group of people who are nothing but, it's a crime cartel, which enables people either on without documents, meaning they have a passport, genuine passport, no visa, helps them enter another country, or produces fake documents and enables them to enter another country, right? But the result is that there are groups that are enabling them to happen. Smuggled are those where I will ensure as a smuggler that you are helped to cross the border, after which you are on your own. I mean, I don't care what happens to you. A trafficked person is one where I continue to control what you do after you have entered that country, including the work that you do and so on and so forth. Now, the real challenge I think that we should pose is to these cartels. So the reason why there should be emphasis on combating irregular migration, combating smuggling, and combating trafficking is because there is a moral hazard involved. If we don't attack these cartels, people will continue to become objects and victims of the smuggling and trafficking. On the question of did government act in time? Well, I'll put it this way. I am on the civil society side now, okay? I'm looking at it from a different prism altogether. But just to be correct on facts, for emigration purposes, Iraq is a banned country, okay? From India's policy, stated policy is that Indians should not work in Iraq, simply because it was a conflict zone. It was not even being regulated by international organizations. American military was not handling law and order there. Surrogates for, were handling. Blackstone was actually managing all the law and order there. So government had taken a decision. Indians should not go to Iraq. Now, what used to happen was these cartels would actually enable them to go first to, say, Dubai, and then from there on to Iraq. So politically, it was very difficult for India. And, it's not so easy. If you're dealing with, in the real world, it doesn't work in the manner that a human rights lawyer stands up and thumps the table and say that, I want human rights. Yes, the ISIS fellow just shoots you and say, here are your human rights. So in the real world, it doesn't work that way. So I will not comment on whether India responded well enough, timely enough, or so on. I think it's fair to say that as a state, Indian consulates do try to do their best to protect Indian citizens. Sometimes they fail, but I don't think systemically we can say that India is a soft state which the foreign service of which doesn't try to protect its citizens.
Thank you. For Madhurima, I think your presentation was quite comprehensive. But I was just wondering if you have any kind of information on Indians who are also detained abroad because either their visa expires or they become irregular migrants or they happen to travel abroad, like Sir said, on the wrong documents or whatever, because Indians also constitute FNPs abroad. So.
So yes, the answer is we do. We did a study last year to understand what are the barriers in getting the Indians back home, because so there is an act called the Repatriation of Prisoners Act, 2003. Now that it says repatriation, but actually should be transfer. That deals with transfer of prisoners from one country to another. So now internationally, a lot of countries have such acts or treaties between them, which allow the prisoners, like suppose an Indian is abroad. If we have a treaty with them, the Indian can serve the rest of the sentence back in India. So that solves a lot of problems in terms of the things I talked about the problems in deportation and nationality verification, because then of course you're back here, the moment you end your sentence, you are free to go. So there is no bureaucracy involved there. However, not a lot of Indians are actually taking it up, and that same goes for people here from foreign other countries. They are not really taking the benefit of the Repatriation of Prisoners Act, which could be, there are of course issues of awareness, people don't know about it. There are issues of access. So even for Indians who are imprisoned abroad, there are 2 or 3 problems that the government faces, our missions face. One is they also don't get information of their arrest. So the police there also do not inform. In certain countries where there are very strict privacy laws, they are actually banned from informing. They can't share that information. Third is, so consular access is also dependent on the consent of the person. So if a person says, I don't want my embassy to be informed, there is no mandate or binding on the police or the prison department to inform. So one of the reasons that the embassy, the MEA has been saying is that Indians don't want consular access. Now I have a problem with that, because it could also be the fact that Indians don't know what a consulate person would do for me. So it's not really informed consent, or it's not an informed waiver in that sense. So those issues are there in terms of the embassy trying to contact the person. Now, other than that, the study we did looked at the barriers. What are the problems in Indians trying to avail the Repatriation of Prisoners Act to come back to India, and there are quite a few barriers. And there is a handout outside. There's a flyer that we have brought today, which actually talks about the barriers in details, explains the process. And in terms of numbers, so
that I'd like you all to register. One of them, of course, is very much that as a country, how can we go about saying we open doors and it's okay for irregular people to be in and out? It's like protecting your national boundaries. And this is not India doing this. This is every country in the world doing this, where they're taking a stronger stance because they believe that it helps protect their labor market for their nationals. I'll tell you how that works out, but that's what they believe. And then for India, I think it's also an image issue, frankly speaking. We like to have this image where we are a good migrant sending country, where we want to pursue regular migrants going, and that's a good stance to have. It's good that we want to see regular migrants going. But it's almost as if we want to try and keep that market, and we want to keep that image, and we want to protect it for ourselves. And so if we appear as a country that actually is promoting regular migration, taking a very strong stance under irregular migration, we are the ones who will actually gain in the long term from this. We may not, but that's how it's looked at. And then there may just be another third angle, which increasingly in my work I find quite disturbing. I meet a lot of irregular migrants who are Indian, and they are Indian. They do seek various recourses to be in other countries, and they are rejected by the Indian government very often. The Indian government does say that, how do we know you're Indians? We don't know, there's all this. And there is a similar thread somewhere along these people, and this is what captures my attention sometimes. They do belong to certain groups of India. They don't belong to you and me classes. The irregular migrants don't necessarily come from a certain class, a certain caste, a certain group. They come from minorities very often. You will have differences in the Gulf where large numbers become irregular for their own legal spaces, and those may be still more mixed. But the other Indians that you will find who are irregular in Europe, for example, some of them even finding their way, lots of them in the UK perhaps, come from certain minority groups. And I'd like you to just keep this thought, because I'll try and come back to it later. But when you look at, India having this posturing of we send regular migrants, we are very strongly against irregular migrants. What is the implication? What will India do? What will India do here? What will India do as a country? If you ask me, more borders, more detentions, more deportations. For me, this is what India is aiming to do. And as a, someone who works with migrants, and I've been doing this for more than a decade now, actually almost 2 decades, I would say, you find that, is this going to prevent irregular migrants from coming in? This is the question I ask. Is this going to stop them? The answer is no. It isn't. This doesn't work like this. The global world doesn't work like this. And this is where also one has to understand, and what also Mr. Gurucharan was saying, while goods move and there's free movement, people don't have free movement. But it doesn't mean that the forces are not there for them to move. And so I'm going to try, I come from a labor organization. So I'm going to try and look at it from a labor perspective. Now this may be a little different from where you're coming from, because you're lawyers probably, but just so that you understand it. And I'm going to try and simplify it so that you get where I'm coming from. So now you have, try to look at a country like India. We have a very large population. We actually have a lot of underemployment. Unemployment figures vary, but we have a fair amount of unemployment. And it kind of beats the logic. When you have so many people who need jobs, when you have so many youth who are unemployed, why is it that the jobs are going to the migrants? How come the migrants are filling these jobs? What's going on here? How come there are jobs that migrants can even take? And then you look, and then you have to understand that there are structural flaws. The labor markets and what is happening is operating in a certain way. And you see, and you see this around the world, but you see this very much happening in India. And what you see is, if you have more flexibility in the labor market. So we're introducing labor reforms, we just kind of have, where you allow for more outsourcing, where there's more flexibility, where there are lesser inspections, where you have labor markets which are opening up. Yes, and so they're trying to make it easier for companies to do manufacturing. But then you also have stratification of workers. The same rights are not given to migrants as they are given to other nationals. What will happen in this situation? What happens when this happens to a labor market? And this is happening around the world, mind you. What will happen? There's a race to the bottom. There is a race to get the cheapest labor. There is a race to undercut wages, to undercut working conditions. You can do all of this because the system is now allowing you to do this, and actually, in a sense, almost promoting that this can happen, so that there is more manufacturing, so that there is more work for people. But who can undercut? Who is the weakest chain in a labor market? It will be the migrant. It will always be the migrant who can undercut, who will work even lower than somebody who can work, who will go one step lower, whose working conditions can be even squeezed further. And this is for a few reasons. One, of course, that may be, and you can even just look at Bangladesh and India, for example, if the minimum wage is 80 there, you will earn more here. So yes, there is an income that a migrant can make. And so for them, even that little added value is good enough, it's full enough. But then they won't ask for their rights. They won't. So you can squeeze them more because they cannot. And so you will always find that there's somebody who's bringing the labor further down, and the migrants keep filling that. And then you wonder, well, is that, and then there's this rhetoric that, oh, the migrants come in so we don't have the jobs. And it's very easy to blame it on them. It's almost, they're the scapegoats of where countries are failing, of where governments are failing. To actually say, well, you don't have a job because there are all these people coming in, and so we need to have an entire discourse that actually is based and targeting them, as if they are the ones who created this problem, as if they are the ones who actually came and took the jobs. And you have to and then they become the target and they become the scapegoats for these, for many powers actually. And this is happening around the world. This is happening in Europe, this is happening in the US, that the migrant is targeted. Whereas actually, when you look at it, this is not a migrant problem. This is not also the problem of them coming and taking your jobs. And I'll give you an example, and it's an example that really stayed with me, because I thought, how can this happen?